Welcome to the world of my stories. Prepare to dive into a narrative where every plot twist is a new turn of the imagination. Today, you will hear the story, The Great Extinction. At 8 a.m., Table 4 received the body of an unidentified male. Cause of death, extensive myocardial infarction. Standard procedure. Viktor Kogan pulled on his latex gloves. The snap of the rubber sounded far too loud in the tiled hall. In 30 years of working with death, Viktor had grown used to silence. But today, the silence was different. It was flat, sterile. It was as if someone had turned the background noise dial to 0. He approached the body. A man, approximately 40 years old, Caucasian. Viktor switched on the voice recorder. Autopsy number 4091. External examination. Normosthenic build. Rigor mortis in the initial stage. No visible injuries. Viktor took the deceased's hand to take prints for the database. He pressed his thumb against the corpse's fingertip and froze. There was no papillary pattern. Kogan wiped his glasses. He switched on the bright magnifying lamp. The skin on the fingers was perfectly smooth, not worn away by acid, not burned by fire, not sliced off. It was inherently smooth. There were no pores, no micro-relief. It resembled a cheap mannequin or a wax figure cast with a defect. Epidermal anomaly, Viktor dictated dryly, though a chill ran down his spine. Total absence of dermatoglyphics. He shifted his gaze to the face. Eyelashes. There were none. Instead of a row of hairs, the eyelids were bordered by a solid black streak, as if drawn with a marker. The texture of the iris was a blurry smudge without any radial lines. The elevator ascended to the 5th floor. Viktor stared at his reflection in the metal door. Was it just his imagination, or were the wrinkles on his forehead becoming shallower? He blinked. It was just his imagination. The ICU resembled a war zone, but without the blood. A teenager sat on a gurney in the hallway. He was staring at his hands and wailing. The sound was monotonous, looped. Viktor stepped closer. The boy's hands had turned into mittens. 4 fingers had fused into a single block of flesh. His knuckles had vanished, replaced by sharp, chiseled angles. The phalanges no longer moved independently. "It hurts," the boy screamed. "I can't feel my fingers. They're stuck together." Viktor grabbed his hand. The skin felt hard, like plastic. He couldn't feel any joints inside. The bones had also fused, forming a single, broad plate. The department head, Dr. Hellman, pulled Viktor into the staff room and switched on the TV. "It's everywhere," Hellman said. His face was pale, and his nose appeared unnaturally sharp, like a triangular prism. On the CNN screen, a reporter was broadcasting from Tokyo. "Authorities cannot explain what is happening. People on the streets are complaining of a loss of vision and touch." The camera zoomed in on the crowd. It was monstrous. The faces of the people in the background were blank ovals. Those standing closer had triangular protrusions instead of noses and diamond-shaped voids instead of eyes. "What kind of virus is this?" Hellman asked. It's not a virus, Viktor said, watching the screen as the sky over Tokyo suddenly flickered and the clouds turned into a set of flat sprites for a split second. It's anything but a virus. Viktor walked to the window. Seattle was changing. The Columbia Center skyscraper had lost its glass exterior. Now it was simply a black, monolithic, rectangular prism. The trees in the park below stopped swaying in the wind. They froze as static objects. The foliage merged into green polygons. It looks like archiving, Viktor whispered, as if the universe itself is at capacity. He rushed to the computer. His fingers were still obeying him, though his joints were already clicking, struggling to hit the keys. He opened a paleontology database. Tabs: Permian extinction, Cretaceous-Paleogen extinction. Viktor had always been fascinated by evolutionary history. Now the puzzle was forming a nightmare. Dinosaurs, massive, complex organisms. Gigantism requires colossal computing power to calculate the physics of movement, metabolism, and skin textures. What happened 66 million years ago? Not a meteorite. The meteorite was a cover story. Disk formatting. The system deleted heavy files to free up space for mammals, small, optimized creatures with simple fur. Then came the megafauna, mammoths, giant sloths. Deletion again, to save resources. Then came the giants, though that is now considered myth. And then humans. At first there were few of us. We were simple, but we multiplied. We created civilization, cities, the internet, art, trillions of terabytes of data. We overcomplicated the structure of reality. Each person is a unique data set, DNA, memory, physical structure, 8 billion unique high-detail objects. The server is overloaded. The compression protocol has been triggered. JPEG for reality. The realization of the full picture made Viktor feel physically ill. "Look!" Hellman shouted. In the hallway, a nurse dropped a tray. It fell with a dull, flat thud, and the syringes vanished before they even hit the floor. They were too small. They were fine detail. The system had cut them out. The nurse herself stood there, gasping for air. Her lips were fusing together, first at the corners, then the seam raced toward the center. She tried to scream, but the skin stretched tight, sealing her mouth shut. A second later, only smooth skin remained on the lower half of her face. Her eyes turned into black, pixelated dots. Her nose retracted inward. She had become a mannequin. But she was still alive. Her chest jerked convulsively. Her lungs demanded air, but the respiratory tract no longer existed. Viktor ran outside. The hospital was turning into a cubic structure. The corners of the walls became razor sharp. Concrete textures blurred into a gray haze. The city wailed. It wasn't a human cry. It was a digital screech, the sound of a corrupted audio file. At the intersection, cars sat idle. Their wheels had become octagonal. The vehicles didn't drive. They glided in stutters, clipping through the textures of the asphalt. The people. What was happening to the people was beyond biological comprehension. The running crowd was merging. The compression algorithm decided that calculating 100 separate objects was irrational.
People began to combine into clusters. Viktor saw a woman collide with a man. Their shoulders touched, and the flesh instantly fused. Their clothes became a single texture. Their bodies began to stretch and deform, forming a single multi-legged organism. Two heads merged into one wide, flattened mass. 4 eyes turned into 2 enormous, cloudy saucers. The creature took a step, and its leg bent unnaturally backward. The knee joint had been deleted. Viktor looked at his hands. The pinky and ring finger of his left hand had fused. The lines on his palm vanished. His skin became gray and matte. "No," he rasped. His voice sounded like it was coming from an old radio. The bit rate was falling. In the sky, an abyss opened. The sun was no longer a sphere. It was an icosahedron, a brilliant white 20-sided solid hanging in a purple sky without gradients. Waves radiated from the icosahedron, a grid, the wireframe of reality. Green lines sliced the space into squares. Anywhere a grid line passed, matter vanished. Houses were sliced in half, leaving a black cross-section without interiors. Viktor realized this wasn't just compression. This was archiving before transfer or deletion. The system sees repeating patterns. Humans are identical. Why store copies? One had to become unique. One had to become complex. The compression algorithm, like JPEG or MP3, deletes information it considers insignificant or redundant. It smooths out gradients, simplifies shapes. To survive, one had to create a form that the algorithm could not simplify without losing data.
One had to become chaos. One had to create a geometry of flesh so complex that the system would deem it a critical file. Viktor burst into a hardware store that had already lost its sign. It had become a mere white rectangle. The storefront windows had vanished. On the shelves lay not tools, but generalized models of objects labeled item hammer and item saw. The textures hadn't loaded yet. He grabbed an object labeled as an axe. It felt weightless in his hand, like a polygonal model. Viktor looked at his reflection in a sheet of metal. His face was simplifying. His nose was gone. His ears were receding into his skull. He was turning into a dummy. He had to break the symmetry. Symmetry was the enemy. Symmetry is easily compressed. Viktor swung the axe. A strike. The blade bit into his left shoulder. There was almost no pain. His nervous system had already been simplified. Blood splattered in cubic droplets. Viktor hacked at himself. He was turning his body into a jagged, chaotic wound. He broke his fingers at unnatural angles so they couldn't fuse into a mitten. He sliced his cheek, creating a complex, serrated scar that couldn't be described by a simple equation. "I am not compressible," he wheezed. He gouged out his own eye. An empty socket is a complex geometry of shadow. He shoved pieces of metal, glass, and debris into his wounds. He was making himself an error, a glitch, an unreadable sector. Around him, the world was turning into a Nintendo 64 game. Buildings became cubes. People turned into meat pyramids that rolled across the ground, emitting a low hum. Viktor stood in the middle of this low-poly hell. He was the only high-detail object left. A bloody mess, protruding bones, pieces of rebar sticking out of his ribs. He was monstrous. He was magnificent in his complexity. The grid descended lower. It passed through the neighboring building, deleting it. The line approached Viktor. He raised his mutilated hand. "Try and compress this, you bitch!" He roared at the geometric sky. The grid touched him. The world froze. Viktor felt the scanning beam pass over every millimeter of his tortured flesh. It analyzed every tear, every shard of bone, every liter of pixelated blood. System message. Object ID. Human 749201. Status. High complexity detected. Optimization. Failed. Compression ratio 0%. Viktor smiled with his torn mouth. It had worked. He was too complex. The system couldn't simplify him. He would remain. He would be a monument to the old world. But then a new line appeared in the sky. Red text stretched across the entire horizon, eclipsing the icosahedron sun. Error. Corrupted file. Diagnosis. Integrity violation. Action. Move to recycle bin. Viktor stopped smiling. This wasn't a victory. For the system, high complexity that resisted the algorithm did not signify value. It signified an error. He had become a corrupted file, a virus, and corrupted files are not kept. The ground beneath his feet vanished. There was neither light nor darkness, only absolute nothingness. Viktor was falling. Around him in the void floated others who had been deleted. He saw a Tyrannosaurus Rex, massive, intricately rendered with every scale and every feather visible. The beast was alive, panicking and snapping its jaws in the vacuum. He saw giants in 10-foot-tall plate armor. He saw entire cities of ancient civilizations, Atlantis, Hyperborea. They hung in the void, cut out of reality for their excessive complexity. This was the recycle bin, the junkyard of history, and here, in this place where gravity was absent and time stood still, Viktor saw something approaching him. It was composed of trillions of deleted human faces, fingers, and eyes, a colossal sphere of file debris. Emptying recycle bin in 3, 2, 1. Viktor tried to close his eyes, but he no longer had eyelids. He stared into the abyss, and the abyss was preparing to click empty all. The last thing he saw before the final deletion was a mouse cursor the size of a galaxy hovering over him.